Welcome to ACN, the Liberation TV of Ambazonia.
In 2016, the world saw an uprising in Ambazonia. The people rose up to demand justice. First, the world wondered what the Anglophone problem was and what it was all about. Then it watched the Anglophone problem transform into southern Cameroon's Ambazonia War of Liberation. They thought it started in 2016. They thought it was just about the supremacy of one language over another. They thought it was only about the marginalization of the English-speaking people of Cameroon. They thought it was all about 2 cubes of sugar. They thought it was the quest for a disgruntled minority to create another failed state. They were right, because it was the quest of the first democratic state in Africa to reclaim its independence and liberate itself from the tyranny of the most autocratic and corrupt state in Africa. This is when and how it all started. The Chronicles of Ambazonia.
As early as 1938, a branch of Shell Petroleum Company had been granted an exploration license to prospect for oil across Nigeria. It would take Nigeria till 1956 to drill the first commercially viable oil well, a feat that undoubtedly influenced the United Kingdom's interest in integrating southern Cameroons into Nigeria, with the hope that the territory would also be oil-rich. The pace of oil prospecting in the Republic of Cameroon accelerated in the 1960s, leading to the discovery of oil onshore and offshore, the coastal areas of West Cameroon by ELF, the French oil conglomerate. As good as it was to have discovered significant reserves of oil onshore and offshore, the state of West Cameroon, the Republic of Cameroon, and French governments were concerned that Cameroon's federal system of government could stand in their way of exploiting these reserves in accordance with Cameroon, France's secret commercial accords of 1958 and 1959. As a condition to granting independence to the Republic of Cameroon in January 1960, France had entered into secret accords with Ahidjo that gave France priority rights of exploration and exploitation of all subsoil resources, including oil. These were the same accords that had contributed to the 1958 overthrow of André-Marie Bida, the first head of government of French Cameroon, who had vehemently refused to sign them or agree to a certain kind of independence from France. The conflict of interests in these oil reserves between France, Ahidjo, and the state of West Cameroon was triggered not by events within Cameroon, but rather by Algeria's decision to nationalize 4 foreign oil companies in June 1970. At issue in Algeria were the 1965 Evian Accords between France and Algeria, where the government of Algeria was coerced into accepting only 28 cents per barrel compared to 75 to 90 cents per barrel in other Middle Eastern or South American countries. Faced with economic decline, massive capital outflows, and rapidly increasing government spending, the government of Algeria quickly became dissatisfied with the Evian agreements and decided to break the agreements and take over foreign oil companies. With this background, French President Pompidou and French Minister of African Affairs Jacques Foccart visited Cameroon in 1971 and started working on a plan to address this potential threat to the French-Cameroon secret accords. On May 2nd, 1972, President Ahidjo met with the Central Committee of the Cameroon National Union, or CNU, the highest organ of the only political party in the Federal Republic of Cameroon. Plans were put in motion for what would later be called the peaceful revolution of the people of Cameroon, the dismantling of the federal structure of government in favour of a unitary system of government, giving the president even more powers than he already had. On May 5th, 1972, President Ahidjo returned from a short trip to Paris, where he had met with his French legal advisors. In his briefcase from Paris were some very important documents, printed copies of a new constitution for the Federal Republic of Cameroon. He immediately called for an extraordinary session of the Federal Assembly in Yaoundé for May 6, 1972, with the purpose of proposing his new constitution. While one would normally expect the legislator of a country to be responsible for enacting new legislation, President Ahidjo had previously assumed the powers of the legislature and many other branches of government through a series of never-ending state of emergency declarations. Whether or not he had the power to enact new legislation, by 1972, President Ahidjo was so powerful that he personally represented the state, and anyone or any branch of government that dared question his authority ended up in solitary confinement in one of the many prisons around the country. However puzzling it may be that the president could unilaterally revise a country's constitution and himself propose a new constitution to the legislature or National Assembly, It is even more bizarre that the president was not himself the author of the new constitution he was proposing. The real authors of the proposed constitution were French technical advisors, one of whom was Jacques Rousseau, the man credited for writing the Republic of Cameroon's first constitution of February 1960. On May 6, 1972, President Ahidjo delivered his much anticipated speech to the Federal Assembly of Cameroon in Yaoundé. He acknowledged the great strides that the nation had made over the past decade since the reunification of southern Cameroons with the Republic of Cameroon in October 1961, following the UN-sanctioned plebiscite of February 11th, 1961. President Ahidjo noted that over the past decade, the people of the states of West and East Cameroon had become reacquainted with one another in ways that had fostered national unity like never before. He said that the federal system was adopted during reunification with southern Cameroons, only to assure southern Cameroonians that the legacy they were bringing after more than 45 years of Anglo-Saxon administration would not be ignored, but would also be taken into consideration within the framework of a bilingual and multicultural state. However, he quickly focused on the need to address the federal structure of government and the costs it was imposing on the country. He noted that the federal structure of government required 3 governments and 4 houses of assembly. President Ahidjo was referring to the governments and houses of assembly of the federal, West and East state governments, as well as the House of Chiefs in the state of West Cameroon. He went on to bemoan the West Cameroon budget deficits, which were costing the federal government upwards of 2 billion francs CFA annually. He concluded that given all those facts, the federal structure of government had outlived its usefulness and, instead of being a catalyst for growth, had now become a major handicap.
Dans ces conditions, où les structures fédérales apparaissent comme un handicap au développement rapide du pays, où en revanche, le peuple camerounais a déjà consacré dans les faits sa profonde unité, ma conviction, mesdames et messieurs les députés, ma profonde conviction est que le moment est venu de dépasser l'organisation fédérale de l'État. J'ai, en conséquence, conscient de mes responsabilités à l'égard de la nation et devant l'histoire, décidé de consulter par voie de référendum le peuple camerounais, souverain et maître de son destin, sur l'institution immédiate d'un État unitaire.
He then set the date for the referendum for Saturday, May 20th, 1972, to ask the people of Cameroon whether or not to dismantle the federal system of government, and he invited the legislature and the country to review his draft constitution in the 2 weeks before the referendum. Only people not familiar with the internal politics of the Republic of Cameroon in the 1960s would be surprised that West Cameroon was said to be broke and was draining the coffers of the federal government. When Southern Cameroons joined the Republic of Cameroon on October 1st, 1961, it was a rich and vibrant territory. Southern Cameroons was by then exporting over £5 million of agricultural products to Europe and the US, including bananas, rubber, cocoa, palm oil and peppers, resulting in annual profits of close to £1 million. Its profits had enabled the territory to not only develop its infrastructure and provide services to its people, but had also enabled it to subsidise the government of Northern Cameroons for many years, sometimes in excess of £150,000. In 1961, Southern Cameroons was richer than the Republic of Cameroon on a per capita basis, especially considering that Cameroon was heavily dependent on aid from France. Although President Ahidjo had said only a federal system of government could have best served Southern Cameroons joining with the Republic of Cameroon in 1961, his unilateral action in 1972 proved how half-hearted the Republic of Cameroon's commitment had been. It was clear that the Republic had accepted a federal government in order to appease the people of Southern Cameroons and win their votes in the February 11th, 1961 plebiscite. So how come Southern Cameroons turned West Cameroon went broke between 1961 and 1972? In this interval, President Ahidjo had deliberately dismantled all West Cameroon's economic and infrastructure companies to make West Cameroon appear to be financially dependent on East Cameroon. Powercam, a hydroelectricity dam at Yoke that previously electrified Southern Cameroons, was closed in favour of getting power from East Cameroon. Cameroon Bank, headquartered in Buea, was one of the strongest banks in the Cameroons, was closed. National Produce Marketing Board, that was responsible for selling all agricultural products from the CDC and all of the major plantations through the ports of Tico and Mamfe, was closed, resulting in poor pricing of West Cameroon's produce sold through the port of Douala. Tico Airport, the international airport of Southern Cameroons, turned West Cameroon, was closed in favour of Douala Airport. Tico and Victoria natural seaports were closed. Numerous trade organisations, financial cooperatives and credit unions, engineering and infrastructure organisations and companies were all shut down. By 1972, having intentionally crippled the robust economy that West Cameroon inherited from Southern Cameroons, it made sense that on paper at least, Ahidjo's claim that federalism and not his direct actions was the reason why the government of West Cameroon appeared to be in the red. Once more, West Cameroon, just like Southern Cameroons before it, was being called a poor territory. Ahidjo was simply taking a page out of the United Kingdom's playbook from 1960, when the UK told the United Nations and the nations of the world that Southern Cameroons was poor and would not be viable as an independent country. But it should be remembered that the United Kingdom, in its bid to make Southern Cameroons join Nigeria and bolster its economic interests, had told Nigeria that Southern Cameroons was rich and indeed a treasure trove. Article 47.1 of the Federal Constitution of the Republic of Cameroon stipulated that no amendments could be made that would impair the unity and integrity of the Federation. One could interpret this article to mean that no bill could have been introduced to dissolve the Federation itself, even if the President himself had submitted an amendment to dissolve the Federation. Article 47.3 stipulates that such an amendment should have been voted affirmatively, not only in the Federal Assembly, but equally by the East and West Cameroon Houses of Assembly. Knowing that he could not have gotten this way with the West Cameroon House of Assembly, President Ahidjo cunningly employed Article 2, which mentions the word referendum as a means to enact changes to the Constitution. However, even if Article 2 could have been stretched to serve as a means to make changes to the Constitution, it did not and could not have overridden the very clear language of Article 47. The legal backdoor that President Ahidjo relied on, therefore, was a law passed on the 10th of November 1969 prescribing the conditions and the procedure of the referendum, but even this law should not and could not have overridden Article 47.3. In the prevailing political climate, where dissidents were locked up without due process, no one dared stand up to President Ahidjo's blatant violation of the federal constitution. At the conclusion of his speech on May 8, 1972, all 10 West Cameroon members of Federal House of Assembly walked out together with Jean-Gu Foncha and gathered at Bernard Fonlong's house in Yaoundé, leaving all 40 French Cameroon members of parliament in the house. Tension built up rapidly as President Ahidjo rapidly ordered armed troops to surround Bernard Fonlong's house while negotiating with the members of parliament. After careful reflection, Fonlong advised that they were ill-prepared and outnumbered, and further resistance could have unintended consequences. Bernard Fonlong counselled that they should return to the assembly and leave the war to be fought by their forebearers. Days before the perilous May 6 speech, the government had raised a false alarm of an imminent invasion into West Cameroon from Nigeria, leading to a massive deployment of troops to major towns across the state of West Cameroon. It was not politically wise or physically safe to hold and express views different from the president, let alone oppose, in words or deeds, any of his plans or actions. It was generally known, but highly concealed, in the dictatorial climate of the time, that there was a groundswell of opposition throughout West Cameroon. Ahidjo's speech on May 6th automatically and unceremoniously disbanded the East and West Cameroon Houses of Assembly, as well as the House of Chiefs, none of which ever again formally met. The mutiny was muted and all trace removed from the media. Throughout the referendum campaign season of 12 days, everybody was advised against casting no votes. Civil servants were transferred across the national territory to spread Ahidjo's good news, pushing the yes chorus. They sounded a warning note to all government divisions, all local government areas, that producing a single no vote would result in untold reprisals. Although the government has records of having printed no ballots, on May 20th, 1972, voters discovered that only ballot papers bearing the words yes and we were available. If no ballot papers existed, they were clearly not used in voting offices, if not everywhere, certainly in the majority of voting offices across Cameroon. By midday on May the 20th, 1972, President Ahidjo was already calling the referendum a victory. 2 weeks later, he would sign into law the new constitution on June 2nd, 1972. That was not written or reviewed by the Federal Assembly, not approved or signed by either the East or West Houses of Assemblies, not signed by the Prime Minister of the Federal States of West and East Cameroon. Following the sweeping victory, the population, especially in former West Cameroon, was severely repressed by police forces. Security checks, raids, roadblocks, and police cordons in neighbourhoods increased. Anybody who did not have a voting card in their pocket was arrested. The government and military flexed their muscles to deter any public or even private protests against the illegal dissolution of the Federation, having been denied the option of outright independence by the United Kingdom and having reluctantly participated in the UK and UN sanctioned plebiscite on February the 11th, 1961, resulting in the joining with Cameroon in a federal republic. May the 20th, 1972 is hardly a day of celebration for the people of the former Southern Cameroons. Rather, it is a day that holds little meaning, because it represents the day when the federal system of government that should have guaranteed their diversity and way of life, their educational and legal systems, and much more, was dismantled, accelerating their marginalisation within the now United Republic of Cameroon. The incompatibility of the France-Cameroon secret accords and the rights of the state of West Cameroon with regard to the allocation of revenues from oil and other resources is at the root of the dismantling of the Federation. If this narrative seems far-fetched, the actions of the government in later years only served to reinforce these arguments. The overthrow of the system of government and a return to the unitary system gave the President all the powers to enforce the secret 1959 Accords with impunity. In later years, an oil refinery would be built in the coastal town of Victoria by Elf, Total, Gulf and Mobil. To downplay the town's British roots, in 1982, the town's name would be changed from Victoria, so called by English missionary Alfred Saker in 1858, to Limbe. As a cautionary measure by the unitary government against insurrection by English-speaking locals, the Limbe refinery's oil is piped to and stored in Douala, in the French-speaking part of Cameroon, and city taxes from oil exploration and refining are paid not to the town of Limbe in English-speaking Cameroon, but rather to the city of Douala. The refinery in Limbe is overwhelmingly staffed by Cameroonians from French-speaking Cameroon and the rest from English-speaking Cameroon and other countries. These are revenue-sharing imbalances and hiring practices that would never have occurred under a federal system of government. Today, what was formerly Southern Cameroons and subsequently West Cameroon produces over 85% of Cameroon's total oil revenue. Once more, rather than people determining the future of their land had come to define the future of the people. As difficult a pill as May 20th, 1972 was for West Cameroonians to swallow, they chose to rise above it. They chose to continue to hold their heads high. And they chose to live and fight this grave injustice another day. As Bernard von Long wisely said on May 8th, 1972, the West Cameroonians chose to leave the war to be fought by their forebearers.
At www.acnlive.net. This is a production of the Ambazonia Communication Network in collaboration with Menda Films. We invite you to look forward to our next episode as we continue to explore the historical path of the former British Trust territory of Southern Cameroon, now called Ambazonia. Special thanks to our donors and to all viewers like you. For more information on this program, please contact our partners, Menda Films, on www.mendafilms.com or visit us at www.acnlive.net.
Glory, we the Ambazonia, special loyalty, presence to our Savior who granted us the freedom, allegiance to the hero, for God alone we gather, glory to glory, we rise and never to fall, here in a nation, flowing with earth and holy, glory, glory, glory to the Father for making you a nation, a joy forevermore. Ambazonia, land of freedom, you shall live in plenty, meet in our need, and your children shall be like the stars above. The Most High God being the watchman of His nation, Ambazonia, land of freedom, you shall live in plenty, meet in our need, and your children shall be like the stars above. The Most High God being the watchman of His nation.
Good evening, fellow Ambazonians. Greetings, patriots, nationalists, and our courageous people. The stakes are extremely high. During such moments, leadership is critical for the success of our liberation and for the outcome that we seek and we are sacrificing for. Dr. Cho Lucas Ayaba, the leader of our liberation struggle, is on the line to address our people on the eve of our Independence Day celebration. The occupiers' intent must be taken into consideration. The occupier is scheming, creating all sorts of narratives to distort, to distract, to divert. They have injected a new narrative within the opposition with a hope to lower the international system into a new bait. That is why leadership is essential for us to maintain a singular point of focus. That is why at this moment, leadership provides clarity, a sense of direction, and assurance. The leader wants to address our people tonight as the creator of the liberation strategy, the embodiment of the liberation vision. He knows where we are, what is going on. Pay attention. Your victory is here. Listen to the leader very carefully. Listen emotionally. Listen spiritually. Listen psychologically. He's going to speak to you from his soul, from his heart to your heart. Here is the leader of our war of liberation, Dr. Cho Lucas Ayaba, addressing our people from Oslo prison.
My fellow Ambazonian soldiers of all the 13 states of Ambazonia, soldiers of the Ambazonian Defense Forces, the Ambazonian Restoration Forces, the Warriors, Seven Kata, Black Mamba, Mountain Lions, Buffaloes, Avengers, our forces in Boyo. I send personal greetings to all of our generals, our top commanders. In 48 hours, it will be Ambazonia's Independence Day. In 2001, 3 Ambazonians were killed in Bui during celebrations marking the 40th anniversary of our independence. We have not forgotten about them, and I honor their memories. Every October 1, since 2017, you have mobilized our population, raised our flag, sung our anthem, staged military processions to celebrate Ambazonia, our nationalism, our freedom threatened and being defended. These actions have changed forever our destiny. I know you will be doing the same this year. I call on each and every one of you to be mindful of the threats and take every precautions to protect yourselves and our people. Happy Independence Day in advance to all of our forces, to their families, to all of our people, both at home and in the diaspora. On November 30th, 2017, standing at the airport tarmac, built with Ambazonia's money, Bobia declared war on us, simply because teachers said no to the francophonization of our system of education. Lawyers said no to the destruction of the common law system, because we refused to go down on our knees in surrender, because you said no to occupation, exploitation without development, elections without representation. Paul Biya and his cohorts, including Atanganji, could not believe that their slaves could finally be courageous. They have committed hundreds of massacres, burned down Kwakwa to the ground, including more than 5,000 homes across Ambazonia. They burned down more than 400 villages, kidnapped, tortured, and transferred thousands across different prisons, both in Cameroon and in Ambazonia. They have killed more than 30,000 of our people, insisting we must surrender our country to them, accept rule by unelected DOs, SDOs, governors, appointed senators, rigged elections, pay taxes to them and ask no questions, and turn our cheese and funds into their boys. For 9 years, we have committed you, the Ambazonian forces, to the greatest and most difficult battlefields across our country. You have fought at night and during the day. You have fought in the rainy season and you have fought during the dry season. You have fought street by street, block by block in urban towns and in wild jungles. You have fought on Christmas Day and on New Year's Day. Some of you have forgotten your birthdays and the birthdays of your kids because you were fighting. You have fought on the day your commander was killed. You have buried some, then taken your rifle and returned to war. You have fought on the hilltops, in rivers. You have stood valiantly like patriot volunteers. You have fought against a vicious enemy that neither recognizes your humanity, your existence, or any laws. You have fought against an enemy that kills commanders, burned their bodies, paraded the bodies of dead commanders in the public square. An enemy that captures our soldiers, arrests our civilians, interrogate them, execute them, and dump their bodies. Under fire, you have never left the wounded behind. You have risked your lives to recover the wounded and the fallen. On a place day. In 9 years of fighting, you have humbled the Cameroon state and the Cameroon army. In 9 years, you have killed more than 1,500 Cameroon forces. That's about a quarter of the 6,000 poorly paid, hungry, poorly trained soldiers scattered across the 13 states of Ambazonia. You have raided their fortified bases, routed and dismantled their checkpoints, popped them out of armored cars and captured others. You have raided brigades in their country and walked hundreds of kilometers safely back to Ambazonia. You have done well, my soldiers, and we thank each and every one of you for your sacrifices. Ambazonians now stand on the hilltop, looking across a valley, hoping to make it to a free homeland. This valley may be the last mile to cross, but it is also the most difficult. It is guarded by enemy snipers, machine gunners, collaborators, and all the dangers you can imagine. We will still rely on your sacrifices to clear the way. We cannot afford to fail. If we fail, all the generals killed would have died in vain. All the soldiers who have died would have died in vain. All the civilians killed, displaced, disappeared, jailed would have sacrificed in vain. The hope of an Ambazonia of opportunities, free education, free medications, and free hospital visitations. The hope of an Ambazonia military academy, air force, and a country where a police officer cuts a driver cafe and asks him to drive safely instead of asking for 500 amber. A country where when you arrive the Manfi International Airport from the US, a signboard reading, "Welcome home. We are glad to have you back," would have vanished. Asawana, are you all ready to carry the collective burden of 9 millions across the last dangerous mile? Let the gods of Ambazonia continue to guide each and every one of you. Going forward, take your time, put your safety first, and plan well. Rebuild your trust with our population and make them an essential participant in their own liberation. They are your first line of defense and your ears on the ground. Time is on your side. We don't owe the IMF, we don't owe the World Bank, neither do we pay any interest on any loan to the African Development Bank. You don't pay civil servants. The enemy has to fight us with borrowed money and stolen money from Ambazonia. That is why we must crumble their economy, stop them harvesting timber and halt production at CDC. Ambazonia's finest, you have established an indestructible force. Every unit must recruit new fighters. Every unit or barrack must, as a liberation force, have 2 times more fighters than rifles. If there are 10 rifles in a unit, that unit must have 20 men. We must create the Chinese effect, the multiplier effect, necessary against an occupying army. The occupier must know they cannot kill everybody. You have done well, and I congratulate each and every one of you. Ambazonia is free. As I have said repeatedly, we do not owe Cameroon child support. Fear none, bow to none. Ambazonia belongs to us. It is our land. It is the place of our birth. No one, whether from the United Nations, London, Oslo, Washington, will decide the destiny of our country. It is in our hands. And 9 years ago, we started that journey. We will never surrender until we reach Boya. Until we reach Boya, we will never, never leave our journey halfway. Asawana.
Hail this land of glory, we the Ambazonia, special loyalty. Praise to our Savior who granted us the freedom. Our legends to the heroes who fought along the gather. Glory to glory, we rise and never to fall. Here in a nation, flowing with earth and holy. Glory, glory, glory to the Father for making you a nation, a joy forevermore. Ambazonia, land of freedom, you shall live in plenty, meeting our need, and your children shall be like the stars above. The Most High God being the watchman of this nation. Ambazonia, land of freedom, you shall live in plenty, meeting our need, and your children shall be like the stars above. The Most High God being the watchman of this nation.
Welcome to ACN, the Liberation TV of Ambazonia.
In 2016, the world saw an uprising in Ambazonia. The people rose up to demand justice. First, the world wondered what the Anglophone problem was and what it was all about. Then it watched the Anglophone problem transform into Southern Cameroon's Ambazonia War of Liberation. They thought it started in 2016. They thought it was just about the supremacy of one language over another. They thought it was only about the marginalization of the English-speaking people of Cameroon. They thought it was all about 2 cubes of sugar. They thought it was the quest for a disgruntled minority to create another failed state. They were right, because it was the quest of the first democratic state in Africa to reclaim its independence and liberate itself from the tyranny of the most autocratic and corrupt state in Africa. This is when and how it all started. The Chronicles of Ambazonia.
On the afternoon of December 31st, 1959, the SAS Metropolitan airplane took off from Lagos Airport, Nigeria, carrying a distinguished diplomat, someone US President John F. Kennedy would later call one of the greatest statesmen of our century. His airplane would fly southeastwardly across Nigeria and would later call the air traffic controller at Tiko Airport to request clearance over the airspace of the British Trust Territory of Southern Cameroons, before continuing on to Yaoundé, the capital of the French Trust Territory of Cameroon. On that seemingly ordinary day, as the diplomat flew across the skies, the two trust territories of British Cameroons and French Cameroon were equal. Both trust territories had heads of government. Both had state ministers. Both had houses of assembly, capitals, and government offices. They were equal as two peoples, with rich and unique heritages, cultures, identities, judicial, political, and educational systems. While Cameroon got its independence, the next day, on January 1st, 1960, it would take the people of Southern Cameroons another 13 months and 11 days to decide on the future of their territory. Having attended the independence celebration in Yaoundé, the distinguished diplomat travelled to Buea on January 2nd, 1959. He met with the Premier Jongu Foncha and his ministers, as well as the opposition party, led by Dr. Emmanuel Ndele. In a stormy meeting, the distinguished diplomat listened to the leaders of the Southern Cameroons bemoan the very difficult choices that lay ahead of them. This distinguished diplomat was none other than the Secretary-General of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld. What the Secretary-General experienced over those 2 days in Yaoundé and Buea was a perfect reflection of one of his famous quotes. On January 1st, he had raised a glass and toasted the new Republic of Cameroon, however imperfect its path to independence had been. And on January 2nd, across the border in southern Cameroons, he had looked into the unhappy eyes of a territory shackled with what could be easily described as choices from hell. Choices that had been defined by the United Kingdom and the United Nations in the form of a plebiscite. A plebiscite is sometimes called an advisory referendum when governing authority seeks approval to act or not. The decision to order a plebiscite in southern Cameroons was because of an apparent lack of consensus of the path to independence. In order to understand why southern Cameroons even had to resort to a plebiscite, we travel back in time. In the late 19th century, during what came to be called the Scramble for Africa, Germany claimed the area of present-day Cameroon as its protectorate. Following defeat of Germany by the Allied forces in the First World War in 1916, Cameroon was split between France and Britain, with the majority of the former German territory going to France, by an arrangement that came into effect on April 18th, 1916. The French territory was known as French Cameroon, and the British territory was administered as British Cameroons. An Anglo-French agreement was signed in Paris on July 10, 1919, by Viscount Milner and M. Simon, providing for the delineation of the border between the French and English parts. In 1922, the League of Nations formally placed the respective parts of Cameroon under French and English mandates. For ease of administration, on June 26, 1923, while there was technically one British mandate, Britain split the administration of British Cameroons into two, with British Northern Cameroons administered as part of the British Protectorate of Northern Nigeria. Meanwhile, British Southern Cameroons, which were then simply called Cameroons, were formally administered as province of the British Protectorate of Southern Nigeria. Following the Second World War, in 1946, the United Nations was created as the successor to the League of Nations. It designated the respective French and British mandates as trust territories under the administration of France and Britain, respectively. France and Britain signed trusteeship agreements with the UN Trusteeship Council for their respective trust territories. Article 76b of the UN Charter decree that the UN Trustee Council would oblige trust territory administering authorities to foster the development of the peoples in their respective trust territories towards the realization of two very clear objectives: self-government or independence. Furthermore, Article 76b specified that the attainment of this goal would be in consideration of the freely expressed wills of the people of the trust territories. On the 13th of December 1946, having agreed to the terms of the UN Trustee Council and the newly created Charter of the UN, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland undertook to administer the trust territory and people of Southern Cameroons. When the Richards Constitution for Nigeria was promulgated in 1946, Nigeria was divided into 3 regions, and the province of British Southern Cameroons became part of the Eastern region. In 1949, the Bamenda division of British Southern Cameroons province was elevated to full province and became known as Bamenda Province, with its capital in Bamenda. The coastal region of British Southern Cameroons province became known as Cameroons Province, with its capital in Buea. Both provinces were still administered from the eastern region of Nigeria. The change from mandate to trust territory and the implicit guarantee of the eventual attainment of self-government or independence opened the doors wide for the creation of local political parties in the Cameroons. The late 1940s saw the emergence of the Cameroon National Federation, CNF, led by Dr. Emmanuel Ndele, a physician who had recently returned to Buea from the Nigerian School of Medicine in Lagos. Prior to creating the party, he had worked as the secretary for the Workers' Union of the largest agricultural plantation in Cameroon's province, the Cameroon Development Corporation, CDC. Ndele's CNF party was composed not only of Southern Cameroonians, but also of people from French Cameroon who had immigrated to work in the plantations. Following the Ibadan General Conference of 1950, a split emerged within the CNF party. Despite advocating reunification with French Cameroon, it had become apparent that Ndele was more in favour of autonomy within the Protectorate of Nigeria. Ndele was opposed to a number of incentives that would have accelerated the unofficial integration of Cameroons and Bamenda provinces with French Cameroon, including the enfranchisement and the granting of citizenship and scholarships to residents from French Cameroons. This led to a member of the CNF party, Robert Dibunge, a native of Douala in French Cameroon, who at the time had recently emigrated to Buea, and who was also the leader of the French Cameroon Welfare Union, FCWU, to create a new political party. Joining him in his endeavour were Jongu Foncha and Namasu Neres Bile, the then secretary of the CNF. They called their new party Cameroon United National Congress, or KUNC, with Dibonge as president and Bile as secretary general. The KUNC's aim was to work towards reunification of the Cameroons and had the support of Ernest Wande and others of the Union of the Populations of Cameroons, UPC, of French Cameroon. Following the December 1951 elections, 13 Southern Cameroonian representatives were elected to the Eastern Nigerian House of Assembly in Enugu, and included Lanjo, Muna, Foncha, Zay, Gala, Krangson, D, George, Forju, Bile, Charlie, and Motombi, Wuleta, and Endele, entering the assembly at Enugu in January 1952. The representatives declared for Nandi, Azikiwe's, National Council of Nigeria, and the Cameroons, NCNC. 6 of the representatives went on to represent Cameroon's province in Lagos, and Muna and Endele were later named Ministers of Works and Labour, respectively. By 1953, the Southern Cameroon's representatives were becoming unhappy with the domineering attitude of local politicians in the Eastern House of Assembly and the lack of unity among the ethnic groups in the Eastern region. Also, a constitutional crisis had erupted in the Eastern House of Assembly over power sharing between the three regions and the central government, resulting in a leadership vacuum in the NCNC and the dismissal of several ministers, including Muna. In March, a split emerged within the Southern Cameroon's delegation. Endele joined Foncha, Muna, George, Forju, Lanjo, Kangson, Zay and Gala to advocate breaking away from the NCNC. The rest of the delegation, headed by Bile, stuck to the NCNC, advocating tighter integration with Nigeria. Endele's breakaway faction declared a benevolent neutrality and a decision to withdraw from the assembly at Enugu in favour of autonomy for Southern Cameroons. On April 14, 1953, Azikiwe, who would later become the first president of Nigeria, recognised the position of Cameroons as a trust territory and supported their demand for separate regional status. When Muna failed to be reinstated on the 5th of May, Endele and his Cameroons bloc, as they were called, abandoned their seats in the assembly and sat in the hallways. The following day, the Lieutenant Governor was forced to dissolve the Eastern Region House of Assembly. Once at home, the Southern Cameroon's delegation invited all native authorities, ethnic organisations, traditional rulers and chiefs to a conference in Mamfi from May 22nd to the 24th. At the Mamfi conference, which was massively attended, it was unanimously decided that the CNF and KUNC parties should merge to form one political party. Furthermore, an agreement was made to petition the Secretary of the Colonies, Oliver Littleton, to demand a separate and autonomous legislature for the Cameroons. At 2 separate conferences at the colonial offices in London in June and August 1953, the Southern Cameroon's delegation petitioned and pressed hard for a separate region of its own. The UK government agreed, and Southern Cameroons became an autonomous region within the Federation of Nigeria, with its capital still at Buea. Northern Cameroons rejected unification with Southern Cameroons and reunification with French Cameroon, and accepted to forfeit the £150,000 of aid it was receiving from Southern Cameroons to support its administration. Following the June 1953 London Conference, the CNF and KUNC parties merged to form the Cameroon National Congress, KNC, with Endele as president and Dibenge as patron, with the stated goal of creating an autonomous region for Southern Cameroons with Nigeria. No sooner had the KNC been formed than the rest of the ousted members of the KNC banded together to create an opposition party, the Cameroon People's Party, KPP. It was headed by Paul Calais, Bile, Charlie, Samba D, and Motombi Wuleta. Allied to the NCNC, the KPP continued to seek integration of Southern Cameroons with Nigeria. Elections were held in December 1953, and the KNC whipped the KPP, winning 12 of the 13 seats in the Assembly, and sending the message the Southern Cameroons had indeed voted for regional autonomy. On the 1st of October 1954, with the creation of the Federation of Nigeria, the Cameroons and Bamenda provinces ceased to exist and be part of the eastern region of Nigeria, and were grouped for administrative purposes as the Southern Cameroons. Prior to this date, Southern Cameroons had no independent public debt, and the administrating authority did not give it direct financial assistance by way of loans, grants, or any other payment. The Southern Cameroons Regional Assembly held its inaugural meeting on October 26, 1954, on temporary accommodation in the government school in Buea. This day would subsequently be considered Southern Cameroon's National Day. It was administered by UK Commissioner Edward John Gibbons, who reported to the Governor of Nigeria in Lagos. He was assisted by an expatriate, ex officio, and unofficial officers in the persons of Enderley, Kangson, Muna, and George. In the December elections for the Federal House of Assembly in Lagos, 6 persons were elected to represent Southern Cameroons. As was required by the Trustee Council of the UN, the administrating authority of the Trust Territory of British Cameroon submitted annual reports on the progress of the people in the territories towards the achievement of the objectives spelt out in Article 76B of the UN Charter. One of the difficulties expressed by the Trusteeship Council in evaluating the annual report for British Cameroons in 1950 was their inability to separate the financial, statistics and figures for the Trust Territory from within the budget of Nigeria. This made it nearly impossible to determine the extent of expenditure on the development within the Trust Territory. To further complicate matters, although Southern Cameroons was administered separately from Northern Cameroons, the administrating authority of the UK never reported separate financial, statistics and figures for Southern Cameroons. The question of the profitability of Southern Cameroons would later prove very important in deciding the freely expressed wishes of the people. In order to address the opacity of the UK government's financial reporting to the Trusteeship Council, the Council passed Resolution 293, the 7th, on administrative unions affecting trust territories on July 17, 1950, requiring clear and precise separate financial, statistical and other data relating to the trust territory of British Cameroons. Due to the time it took to compile and present them, annual reports were often published late. This was certainly the case with the 1954 annual report, which was published on September 5, 1956. It was a comprehensive report that spanned the period 1944 to 1954. The 1954 report was very revealing about the financial state of the Trust Territory as it entered into negotiations with the UN and the UK to transition from a trust territory to a self-governing or independent state. Regrettably, according to UN archives, the 1954 report would be the last official annual report submitted by the UK government to the UN Trusteeship Council on the trust territory of British Cameroons. On the whole, the annual reports confirmed that Southern Cameroons continued to grow in population, human development, political maturity, and more especially, economic strength. The territory boasted of a vibrant agricultural economy, whose prospects for growth in the late 1950s couldn't have looked any stronger. The annual report for 1954 showed that the Trust Territory was profitable to the tune of £162,000. However, this number was for both Southern and Northern Cameroons. In order to retrospectively assess Southern Cameroon's true financial position in 1954 and later years, it would be necessary to examine the relative contributions of Northern Cameroons and Southern Cameroons to the Trust Territory. Starting with the basics, it is important to note that the surface area and population of Northern Cameroons was roughly equal to that of Southern Cameroons. The administrating authority of the UK favoured a policy of indirect rule, where a native authority of government ruled over the local population. Because the local or native populations were roughly the same, the amount of tax revenue collected by native authorities in southern Cameroons was roughly equal to those collected in northern Cameroons. So, if the northern and southern Cameroons were similar in landmass size, population, and in native authority taxes, how were they different? One key difference is that the size of the workforce in southern Cameroons was not just larger, it was over 50 times that of northern Cameroons. Digging deeper, southern Cameroons had over 40 times the number of semi-skilled workers as northern Cameroons. Southern Cameroons had over 50 times the number of unskilled workers. Southern Cameroons had over 100 times the number of skilled workers as northern Cameroons. One of the main reasons for this enormous difference in quality and quantity in the workforces of southern and northern Cameroons was the scale and strength of the industrialised agricultural sector in southern Cameroons, mostly in the way of the Cameroons Development Corporation, the CDC. The CDC owned vast plantations of rubber, palm oil, bananas, cocoa, peppers, and other crops. The difference in the size and quantity of the workforce of the two areas would impact the percentage of revenue generated, with southern Cameroons contributing a significantly higher percentage of the direct payroll and corporate taxes. In 1954, direct taxes accounted for a whopping 26% of the total revenues of northern and southern Cameroons. Custom duties and excise fees levied on imports and exports accounted for a staggering 61% of total revenues. From 1946 to 1954 and beyond, the Trust Territory had a positive balance of trade, with exports tripling the volume and currency amount of imports. Over 75% of imports came from the UK. And by 1954, well over 85% of exports were destined for UK ports, down from 99% in 1950. But what exactly did these exports reveal about the strength of the southern Cameroons economy relative to northern Cameroons? All £4.9 million worth of exports in 1954 were produced exclusively in southern Cameroons and included bananas, cocoa, rubber, palm oil. Although northern Cameroons was known to produce groundnuts and cotton, neither of these products was exported through the Trust Territory's official ports of Tico, Bota, and occasionally Manfi. Therefore, whatever cotton or groundnuts were produced in northern Cameroons, if any, did not impact the Trust Territory's revenue in terms of custom and excise. Considering that custom and excise fees could only have been generated on exports shipping through official ports, and recognising that all exports reported from 1948 to 1954 shipped through official ports were commodities grown in southern Cameroons. It stands that southern Cameroons accounted for all 61% of revenue marked as custom and excise duties. As noted earlier, the disproportionately larger workforce in southern Cameroons certainly contributed a larger share of the total direct taxes, which accounted for 26% of the Trust Territory's revenue. Based on the relative size of each area's workforce, it is not unreasonable to estimate that southern Cameroons was contributing over 60% of the Trust Territory's direct, non-native authority tax revenue. This would translate roughly to 15.6% of the total revenue for the territory. Considering that it had the much larger economy in the Trust Territory, it can be very conservatively estimated that southern Cameroons contributed at least 55% of each of the rest of the revenue streams in the economy. Putting these very conservative estimates together, it can be reasonably said that southern Cameroons contributed on average 84% of the total revenue of the Trust Territory of British Cameroons. On the other hand, how much of the Trust Territory's expenditure or costs could be allocated to southern Cameroons? The Cameroon Road Fund and Public Works represented the largest sectors in the 1954 budget. These sectors supported the development and maintenance of road networks across the Trust territory. Considering that both parts of the Trust territory had similar land masses, the 1954 report indicates that roughly equal number of roads, over 400, were being developed and or maintained in northern and southern Cameroons. Education represented 9% of the budget. Out of 63 government primary schools in the Trust territory, 30, representing 47% of the total, were in southern Cameroons, while the rest were in northern Cameroons. The ratio of government secondary schools in northern Cameroons to southern Cameroons was 1:1. Although the number of government schools in northern Cameroons was roughly equal to that in southern Cameroons, because southern Cameroons had a lot more volunteer and Christian mission organisations involved in the education sector, southern Cameroons had a significantly larger number of teachers and enrolled students. By 1954, whereas the percentage of school-aged children enrolled in school in southern Cameroons was in the high 20s, the percentage in northern Cameroons was less than 4. This huge disparity in education and development standards between northern and southern Cameroons would later be used to accuse the UK government for abdicating its responsibilities over the course of 40 years as the administrating authority of British Cameroons. Medical expenses accounted for 6% of the 1954 budget. However, according to the 1954 annual report, over 98% of medical expenses were incurred in southern Cameroon's government hospitals. Military and defence, police and prison public services accounted for a combined 9% of the 1954 Trust Territory budget. The breakdown of prison staff by government type indicates that the native authorities bore the larger burden of maintaining the prison system, representing over 60% of the total prison staff. One statistic that reveals the relative contributions of the two parts of the territory is the number of incarcerated persons. Southern Cameroons constantly had less than 45% of the inmate population from 1950 through 1954. Together, these facts indicate that southern and northern Cameroons evenly split the financial burdens for providing essential public safety services. Putting these analyses together and conservatively allocating a high percentage across almost all cost categories to southern Cameroons, it can be fairly and reasonably estimated that southern Cameroon's share of overall cost of the Trust Territory of British Cameroons was about 63%. Now, using the revenues and expenditures of the Trust Territory from 1946 to 1954, as reported in the 1954 annual report to the Trusteeship Council by the United Kingdom, and adjusting the numbers to using the estimated cost allocation of 63% and revenue contribution of 84% for southern Cameroons, and lastly, forecasting revenues and expenses for the period 1955 to 1961, based on the trend over the prior decade, we finally get a realistic and scientifically defendable picture of the overall profitability of the state of southern Cameroons. It is reasonable to state with confidence that as early as 1952, southern Cameroons alone was generating over £500,000 a year in profits for the Crown, and that by the end of the 1959 fiscal year, these profits had risen to over £1 million a year. It is conceivable that southern Cameroon's revenues would have been even higher if it had been in a position to negotiate its own custom and excise duties, and not simply gone along with the so-called favourable status rates stipulated by the UK government. Also, if the annual profits of the CDC had been recognised in the fiscal reports of the Trust Territory, southern Cameroons would have been even more profitable by at least another £200,000 per year. Based on data published by the FAO in 2016, Cameroon remains a leading banana exporting state, with a sizable percentage of that produce still being grown in the former southern Cameroon's territory. Therefore, contrary to the myth and conventional wisdom that southern Cameroons was poor, not only was it profitable 9 years prior to the big debates on its future in 1960, it was clearly a rich and beautiful state. After returning to Buea from Enugu, Endeley started having misgivings about reuniting southern Cameroons with French Cameroon. He was worried that after nearly 40 years of separation, southern Cameroons and French Cameroon would struggle to harmonise their cultural, linguistic, judicial, educational, administrative and political systems. Endeley was inclined to think that being the smaller of the two partners in a union, southern Cameroons would eventually have to make significant concessions in order to achieve goals of national unity, equality and justice. By early 1955, Endeley was still dragging his feet on the issue of the enfranchisement of French Cameroonians residing in southern Cameroons, for fear of giving the UPC a political foothold and losing control of his party, the KNC, to influence from French Cameroon. He delayed a motion on this issue in the House of Assembly following a disagreement with the leadership of the UPC party over the question of establishing a UPC branch in southern Cameroons. There was also a matter of the escalating conflicts in French Cameroon between the administering authority, France, and the UPC. The UPC was advocating for the immediate decolonization, reunification, and independence of French Cameroon, following the revolt by and subsequent banning of the UPC in May 1955. Many UPC leaders were forced into exile and took up residence in Kumba in southern Cameroons. In the global political climate resulting from the Cold War, the governments of France and Nascent, French Cameroon, conveniently labelled the UPC a communist organisation, legitimising their use of lethal force in suppressing it. This would later lead to the little-known Civil War of Cameroon in the late 1950s and 60s, where tens of thousands of innocent civilians were killed. This instability next door was one more reason that drove Endeley to look away from French Cameroon and back towards Nigeria, with the vision of integrating southern Cameroons as an autonomous region. Following Chief Awolowo's visit to southern Cameroons in 1954, Endeley entered into an alliance with the Action Group, a political party in Yoruba-dominated western Nigeria, strengthening the unspoken desire to integrate with Nigeria, considering that prevailing laws prevented French Cameroon residents, including Robert D. Bongay, from participating in elections. The reunificationists within the KNC increasingly felt trapped by Endeley's on-off attitude towards reunification. As a result, in March 1955, John Foncha and Augustin Juha broke away from the KNC to form the Cameroon National Democratic Party, KNDP. The KNDP's stated objective was secession from Nigeria and gradual reunification with French Cameroon. As required by the UN Trusteeship Council, visiting missions were periodically sent to trust territories to report on the progress of the territories towards achieving the objectives of self-government or independence. Following the 1955 visit of the UN mission to the Trust Territory, the mission commended the UK government for instituting a government and legislature in southern Cameroons and a constitutional council of elders in northern Cameroons. They commented that discussions about reunification in the Cameroons were merely based on pre-1916 sentimental feelings that lacked concrete proposals for effecting it. They largely endorsed continued administration with Nigeria for both northern and southern Cameroons. However, there were more important dissenters to the rosy picture painted by the visiting mission to the UN Trusteeship Council. The representative of Guatemala, Emilio Arnaiz, countered that the political union between the Cameroons and Nigeria was more than administrative union, and that the division of the territory in two was contrary to the provisions of the trusteeship agreement. He concluded that these arrangements only prepared the Trust territory towards fulfillment of the UK's own agenda of integrating the territory into Nigeria. The representative of the Soviet Union, Arkady Sobolev, was even more critical. He deplored the lack of a timetable for independence or self-government by the UK and regarded the constitutional changes of 1954 as further consolidation of the UK's agenda of integration with Nigeria. He said neither the legislature in Southern Cameroons nor the Consultative Committee in Northern Cameroons had any powers, as they were all still answerable to the governor of Nigeria in Lagos. And that was true. He concluded by challenging the Trusteeship Council to provide a timetable for independence and to grant full regional status and authority to the Trust territory. In light of these developments, and with the growing pressure within the Cameroons for increased autonomy, the administrating authority started making plans for another constitutional conference to consider upgrading Southern Cameroon's quasi-regional status to full regional status. By the time 1957 rolled around, the political tensions and differences of opinion about the future of the territory were revolving around at least 4 distinct choices as the ways forward for Southern Cameroons. Option 1 was integration with Nigeria, supported by the KNC and KPP parties. Option 2 was secession from Nigeria, a period of independence, then gradual reunification with French Cameroon, supported by Foncha's KNDP. Option 3 was an immediate reunification and independence, strongly advocated by Ernest Wande and other leaders of the UPC party and subsequently De Kumaza's One Cameroon party. OK was essentially the successor of the UPC party after the UPC got banned in Southern Cameroons on May 30th, 1957. Option 4 was outright independence, supported by the Council of Natural Rulers and Chiefs, as well as a large percentage of the general population. This was also the preferred choice of a number of influential leaders and politicians, including Chief Stephen, who would later create the Cameroon's Commoners Party, CCC, Jesco Manga Williams, who would later create the Cameroon's Indigenes Party, CIP, and Paul Calais, who would later create the Cameroon United Party, KUP. While the OK Party initially supported the KNDP's position of reunification with French Cameroon, it was not in favour of Foncha's gradual reunification after a period of independence. Rather, like the UPC, it was advocating for immediate reunification. Because Endeley was against reunification, he anonymously warned electors that a vote against integration with Nigeria would mean immediate rather than gradual reunification with Cameroon. As Foncha was then promising, for a short period of time, the OK Party supported Endeley on this argument because it favoured their desired outcome. Endeley published a manifesto spelling out the reasons against joining French Cameroon. In it, he stated that in the long run, a union with French Cameroon would mean loss of freedoms, of expression, of association, of movement, and even of life. That joining would mean loss of human dignity, conscription to a life of fear, and arrests without charge. After an intense political campaign season, the KNC won the March 15, 1957 elections by a slim margin of 6 out of 13 seats, electing Dr. Endeley as the government business leader of Southern Cameroons. At the Lagos Constitutional Conference of 1957, Southern Cameroons requested and was granted full regional self-governing status within the Federation of Nigeria. A cabinet system of government was introduced in the territory on May 15, 1958, with Dr. Endeley as Premier of Southern Cameroons. on the international stage with the passage of UN Resolution 1207, the 12th of December 13th, 1957, pressure continued to mount for the publication of schedules for the attainment of self-government or independence by all trust territories. On February 19th, 1958, the Southern Cameroon's House of Assembly called for independence. As early as 1959, on April 6, 1958, the natural rulers and chiefs called for complete separation from Nigeria and independence for Southern Cameroons. The fourth and final UN visiting mission arrived in Cameroon on October 29th and stayed through November 14th, 1958. The team comprised of George Solomon of Haiti, Ricky Jalpe of India, Graham Thorpe of New Zealand, and Benjamin Gierig of the US as chairman. At the conclusion of their visit, the mission declared that the people of Northern Cameroons were essentially one with the people of Northern Nigeria and strongly believed their future lay with Northern Nigeria. The mission believed that the people of Northern Cameroons would consent to a plebiscite to decide the future of the territory if so asked, but didn't think one was necessary. Concluding as they did, the mission failed to report the significant difference of opinions and the general call for a popular means of consultation in Northern Cameroons. This failure would be confirmed by the results of a plebiscite a year later. On Southern Cameroons, the visiting mission declared that the people were split between two positions: self-government as a region of Nigeria and separation from Nigeria for a purpose not yet clearly resolved. The visiting mission either failed to identify or simply chose to ignore the most popular option in the territory, which was independence or secession as it was called. It also chose to ignore the fact that Foncha's position leaned more towards separation and independence than towards reunification. In response to the growing popularity of the KNDP's independence and reunification message, Ndele's KNC party joined forces with the pro-Nigeria KPP in the period running up to the elections for the first regional government for Southern Cameroons. As the campaign trails turned to artillery minefields, the battles between the various parties raged on. Premier Ndele set the date for elections as January 24th, 1959. With high hopes of winning the elections, Ndele declared that the winning party's position would seal Southern Cameroon's fate. Surprisingly or not, on December 5th, 1958, 3 weeks after the UN's visiting mission's departure, but before their report was written, France declared that it would end its trusteeship and grant independence to French Cameroon on January 1st, 1960. As for the British Cameroons, the UK vaguely stated that, sometime in 1960, it expected to achieve the objectives set forth in Article 76B of the Charter of the United Nations. There were no utterances of self-government or independence in its declaration. Alas, Ndele's KNC alliance with the KPP couldn't save him, and he lost to Foncha's KNDP by a narrow margin of 13 to 14 seats in the House of Assembly. One reason for the KNC's loss was Paul Calais' decision to run as an independent candidate. Following the election, he was expelled from the KNC. He would later create the Cameroon United Party in 1960, advocating for outright independence for southern Cameroons. The majority of votes cast in the elections represented a desire for neither integration with Nigeria nor reunification with French Cameroon. KNC and KPP votes were essentially votes against reunification, whereas KNDP votes were votes against integration in Nigeria. The traditional rulers took some credit for the upset victory of the KNDP and took the position that the election results clearly opposed integration with Nigeria and therefore supported independence. The 1959 election represented the first of many UK-backed coups to drive southern Cameroons towards integration with Nigeria. As the UK's chosen candidate, Endeley had used government vehicles for campaigns, an advantage Foncha did not have. As the powerful premier, Endeley had used his influence to redraw electoral districts to give his party an unfair advantage and disproportionately gain more seats. So although Foncha won by a wide margin of almost 60% of the popular vote, he did beat Endeley by only one seat in the assembly. On January 30th, 1959, John-Gu Foncha took over as premier and administered southern Cameroons along with J.O. Field as commissioner and Malcolm Meline as deputy commissioner of southern Cameroons, all reporting to James Robertson, governor of Nigeria, resident in Lagos, Nigeria. In February, the US Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, noted that the KNDP victory represented a blow to the UK's plans of integrating southern Cameroons into Nigeria. It was also stated that although Foncha had not yet revealed his policies, he was expected to favour independence over a loose association with French Cameroon. No sooner had the election dust settled than Endeley and Billey of the KNC and KPP alliance dispatched a telegram to the UN, arguing that the election results were not conclusive on the fate of southern Cameroons on account of the KNDP's very narrow margin of victory. They challenged the KNDP to a debate in the Southern Cameroons House of Assembly prior to returning to the UN to clearly state its position. The pro-reunification UPC and OK camps, comprising Felix Mullier, Ernest Wande, Mai Matip, De Koumaza, Andre Marie Bida, and many others, took off for New York in early February 1959. They were going to advocate for immediate reunification and independence of all the Cameroons at the special Cameroons UN session. They were being financially and otherwise sponsored by a handful of African governments, Nasser of Egypt, Krumah of Ghana, Touré of Guinea, who among other things were against the creation of what was at the time termed microstates, or small countries, the size of southern Cameroons. At the UN, speaking for the OK Party, Koumaza ridiculed the idea of integration into Nigeria as an acceptable means of terminating trusteeship, stating that such a decision would be inconsistent with the Charter of the UN. He advocated immediate reunification and independence of all Cameroons. Failing that, he reluctantly admitted that a plebiscite would have to be conducted over both French Cameroon and British Cameroons to ascertain the will of the people about their future. Koumaza didn't consider a plebiscite a fair solution. He stated his mistrust of the UK government and the unspoken agenda of integrating both southern and northern Cameroons into Nigeria, and proposed conditions under which a plebiscite might be considered acceptable. Felix Mullier of the UPC concurred with Koumaza. In the case of French Cameroon, he demanded that free and fair elections be carried out before independence, the hope being that the UPC, then a leading grassroots political party, would win elections, oust Amadou Ahidjo, and install a government in French Cameroon chosen by the people and not by the French government. Next, the 1958 Cameroon's Mission Report came up for consideration in the Trusteeship Council. It was very curious to note that although the mission concluded its visit in mid-November 1958, it didn't submit its final report to the Trusteeship Council until after the January 1959 elections. In fact, the report was submitted on February 6, 1959, right before the start of the Cameroon's special UN session. Not surprisingly, and in line with Endelay's telegrams with the UK's wishes, the mission's conclusion was that the election's results in southern Cameroons could not be regarded as decisive so far as the future of this part was concerned. With regards to northern Cameroons, Sir Andrew Cohen, the UK government's representative at the UN, declared British impartiality and willingness to agree to a plebiscite in northern Cameroons if the need had been demonstrated. But since this was not the case, he did not think that the Trusteeship Council would wish gratuitously to burden the people of northern Cameroons with the paraphernalia of a mere formal consultation. In other words, a plebiscite would be a useless and unnecessary exercise, and the mission's recommendation of integrating northern Cameroons into Nigeria would be endorsed without question. Contradicting this view was the Soviet Union representative, Mr. Arkady Zobolev, who questioned whether the mission had considered the loudly expressed wish for separation of the people of northern Cameroons in 1953, before deciding that nobody in the northern Cameroons had demanded separation. Replying to this question, the chairman of the mission, Benjamin Gierig, declared that the mission had not observed any important opposition to the status quo in northern Cameroons. Further attempts to cross-examine Gierig were frustrated by Andrew Cohen over procedural and technical questions. By the time the debates ended, the council was clearly divided on the question of a plebiscite in northern Cameroons between supporters of Cohen, supporters of Zobolev, and the uncommitted. Before the council resumed on February 18, 1959, the UK had arranged for the Minister of Northern Cameroon's Affairs in the Northern Nigeria regional government based on Kaduna, Malum, Abdullahi, Damburam, Jada, to come and address the special UN session. When the session resumed, the British and Soviet Union stuck to their positions, and the uncommitted decided in favour of a plebiscite. Seeing that a plebiscite in northern Cameroons was no longer avoidable, British supporters embraced it with the plan to improve the situation in southern Cameroons in favour of integration. The representative of New Zealand put it as follows: in view of the unanimity of opinion in the north, the only result of a consultation would be to strengthen the proportion of those throughout the territory who wished to accede to Nigeria. Andrew Cohen tried to lobby the Trusteeship Council that although John Foncha had won the 1959 elections, the election results were contradictory to a poll that the UN visiting mission had conducted as to the future of southern Cameroons. On this basis, he urged the Council to endorse the visiting mission's recommendation of a plebiscite in southern Cameroons. However, owing to the tug-of-war in the Council, on February 18, 1959, Resolution 1926, the 23rd, was passed, essentially postponing a decision on everything concerning British Cameroons. The Soviet Union abstained from voting on the resolution on the grounds that it was inconsistent with the recommendations of the visiting mission. Defending the position of the UK on Northern Cameroons, Malan Burham endorsed the visiting mission's position for immediate integration of Northern Cameroons with Nigeria without a plebiscite. This was contrary to his position during the UN mission's visit in November 1958. On the question of a union with French Cameroon, he argued that the relatively short-lived German Cameroon protectorate from 1884 to 1914 did not create strong enough geographic, economic, racial or cultural affiliations to the people of French Cameroon to warrant reunification. He argued that the border had arbitrarily separated a large segment of the Northern Cameroon's population from their natural traditional rulers, the sultans and emirs in northern Nigeria. Malam Dan Berman's argument strengthened the UK's argument for integrating Northern Cameroons with Nigeria. Although the UK had done very little to develop Northern Cameroons, it desperately wanted to integrate it with Nigeria to consolidate and strengthen its economic and political ties. On the political landscape, the UK needed to appease Northern Nigeria's elites, especially Sir Ahmadu Bello, the Sardana of Sokoto, and Tafawa Balewa, who had been instrumental in the creation of a Nigerian federation. In the third week of February, Endeley and Foncha arrived in New York. Addressing the Fourth Committee of the UN, Endeley endorsed the visiting mission's recommendation for a plebiscite on the question of reunification. He said it was an idea that was neither provided for in the trusteeship agreement nor supported by responsible opinion in French Cameroon. He said only irresponsible people still pursued a barren idea of reunification for which no program had ever been worked out. Yet, paradoxically, he concluded that only two options, association with Nigeria or reunification with French Cameroon, should be on the ballot. Endeley's choice of reunification as the second option was based on the hope that people would fear and detest it so much so that they would instead choose to integrate with Nigeria. On his part, Foncha clearly stated that the KNDP had won the election on a specific platform: secession before Nigeria became independent, a short period of UK trusteeship, the possibility for reunification would be explored, independence, and eventual reunification if discussions with the government of Cameroon were successful. Foncha's choice of questions on the plebiscite were secession versus integration with Nigeria. According to him, reunification was predicated first by secession and depended on discussions with French Cameroon. For this reason, reunification should not and could not be a question on the plebiscite. At one point, the representative of India, C.S. Jai, asked Foncha whether if reunification post-secession failed, did he envisage a separate independent state of southern Cameroons, and if so, would it be economically viable? To both of which, Foncha replied a resounding yes. When it became apparent that Foncha was clearly leaving open the door to complete independence, as he had stated, he was pressured to define with absolute clarity the process for negotiating reunification. Understandably, this was something he could not satisfactorily answer, because he had barely taken over as Premier and had certainly never approached the French Cameroon government on the question of reunification. By the end of the deliberations, the Fourth Committee was confronted with the same four positions that had emerged in the territory as far back as 1957. 1. Integration with Nigeria, favoured by the KNC and KPP alliance. 2. Secession, leading to independence and membership in the Commonwealth, favoured by the Council of Chiefs and natural rulers. 3. Secession, leading to independence, then reunification with French Cameroon, or outright independence, a position favoured by the KNDP. 4. And finally, immediate reunification, pure and simple, advocated by the UPC and the OK parties. At the conclusion of the 13th session, the UN passed two sweeping resolutions affecting the Cameroons. Resolution 1349 of March 13, 1959 stated that French Cameroon would attain independence on January 1st, 1960. By gaining independence, the trusteeship agreement would cease to be in force in accordance with Article 76b of the Charter of the United Nations. Resolution 1350 of March 13, 1959 on British Cameroons recommended that Northern Cameroons hold a plebiscite in November 1959 to decide between the following two options. Do you wish the Northern Cameroons to be part of the northern region of Nigeria when the Federation of Nigeria becomes independent? Or are you in favour of deciding the future of Northern Cameroons at a later date? For Southern Cameroons, the UN recommended that a plebiscite be conducted between December 1959 and April 1960, decided that the two alternatives to be put before the people should be considered at the 14th session of the GA. The significance and power of these resolutions make March 13th, 1959 one of the most important dates in the history of the Cameroons. Whereas French Cameroons, rightly or wrongly, depending on whether you were supporting the incumbent Ahidjo government or the UPC, got a promise for its independence on January 1st, 1960. It is important to note the calamity that the UN bestowed upon Southern Cameroons, rather than honouring the divergent positions argued before the Fourth Committee as the freely expressed wishes of the people of Southern Cameroons. The UN unilaterally, and in the interest of the UK alone, narrowed down the options to two alternatives, and to appear to be impartial and escape the scorn of history, the UN carefully avoided stating what the text of the two alternatives of Resolution 1350, Section the 13th, ought to be. What then was the purpose in narrowing down the choices to two alternatives, when clearly there were more than two choices, and there was no consensus on only two questions, if not to stifle and ultimately try to kill the freely expressed wishes of the people? Following the return of the delegations from the UN A May 11th, 1959 declassified State Department report analysed the situation in southern Cameroons. It was authored by John Emerson, the US Consul General in Lagos, Nigeria. Emerson noted that the KNDP wanted a simple vote on secession from Nigeria, yes or no, whereas the KNC-KPP alliance insisted on the two extremes, union with Nigeria or with French Cameroon. He went on to say that the KNDP was confident that the vote for secession would be decisive and would be favoured by over 90% of the voters. According to the report, Ndele conceded his alliance would lose if secession was on the ballot. Ndele acknowledged that the only way he could win was to pit the people against the two undesirable choices. He hoped that the fear of joining French Cameroon would be greater than the fear of staying in Nigeria. In June 1959, the UK government embarked on its first of many post-election projects to pull the rug from under the KNDP's plans of asking for separation from Nigeria and independence for southern Cameroons. To appreciate how the UK went about this, it is worthy to note that although it had gained full regional status in 1958, the Southern Cameroon's government was never independent of the UK government. It reported to a hierarchy of the UK colonial administrators, including the Deputy Commissioner, the Commissioner, the Governor and the Secretary of the Colonies in London. Under these circumstances, Deputy Commissioner Malcolm Milne hired Sir Sidney Phillipson, a former financial advisor at the University Hospital of Ibadan in Nigeria, as a temporary advisor to the government of Southern Cameroons. Sir Phillipson's mandate was to create a report of the financial and economic consequences of Southern Cameroon's separation from Nigeria. The preamble of Sir Phillipson's report was quite revealing as to the real intent of his undertaking. He opened by stating that although his report was in no way politically motivated, it was necessary to acknowledge that Southern Cameroons had before it 4 options as the way forward. 1. Integration with Nigeria. 2. Separation from Nigeria and a further period of trusteeship. 3. Separation from Nigeria and eventual integration with French Cameroon. 4. Separation and independence. Sir Phillipson then swiftly and unequivocally dismissed the last option, stating that support for separation and independence was almost non-existent in the territory. He couldn't have been more political if he'd tried. He conceded that if his assignment was to determine the economic consequences of Southern Cameroons separating from Nigeria to eventually integrate with French Cameroon, the view of a single investigator working within fairly strict time limits and without wide consultations would be of no value. Therefore, by a process of elimination, presuming that option 1 of joining Nigeria had no negative consequences and therefore did not warrant any analysis, Sir Phillipson concluded that his assignment should be concerned with the consequences of separating from Nigeria with a further period of trusteeship. In his general approach, Sir Phillipson noted that Southern Cameroons, wanting to break away from rich and powerful Nigeria after 40 years of association, would only create problems for itself that could otherwise be avoided, and that this path represented the hard way forward. Sir Phillipson confessed that he would have to make personal judgments in arriving at his conclusions, but was quick to add that his personal judgments would not substantially affect his conclusions. The analysis leading up to hard facts and forecasts were riddled with disclaimers, calls for greater analysis and references to reasons not to trust the conclusions he would present. Taking all of this into consideration and adding in some fuzzy math, Sir Philipson concluded that in 1959, Southern Cameroons was broke and would probably remain broke for the foreseeable future. This has since come to be known as one of the many falsehoods propagated by the UK government to weaken Southern Cameroon's case for separating from Nigeria and becoming independent. As shown earlier, and contrary to Sir Philipson's shoddy work, Southern Cameroons would have been profitable on an annual basis by almost £1 million in 1959. The questions that beg to be asked are, why did the UK government have to hire an expert to create a financial report for the UN that it should normally have been generated as required by the trusteeship agreement? Why didn't the UK government turn to the same Colonial Statistics Office that generated the annual reports for the years 1944 to 1954 to produce the 1959 report? The answer was quite simple. The UK government wanted to create ammunition to heavily influence the choice and language of the two plebiscite questions in favour of its interests. It is no coincidence, therefore, that Sir Philipson's final report was delivered to the UN Trustee Council on October 9th, 1959, just in time for the resumption of the debates on the future of Southern Cameroons. Whether a deflection or the truth, in his memoirs, Malcolm Mayne would later credit St. Muna with the idea of hiring a financial consultant. He claimed Muna confided in him that the Foncha government was seeking financial advice on the consequences of separating from Nigeria, which he gladly obliged. From April through August 1959, political parties, leaders of youth organisations and traditional rulers held hundreds of meetings to canvass support for their positions, with the aim of driving consensus towards the two plebiscite questions. The Commissioner of Southern Cameroons, J.O. Field, convened a delegates' meeting in Manfi, chaired by none other than Sir Sidney Philipson. The conference was attended by several hundred people, including 45 delegates, representing political parties, influential organisations, native authorities, and chiefs. True to himself and his mission, Sir Philipson opened the conference by reiterating that Southern Cameroons only had three options open to it, none of which included separation and independence, and were integration with Nigeria as a self-governing region, separation from Nigeria with an extended period of trusteeship, separation from Nigeria followed by early negotiations for reunification with Cameroon. Next, Foncha addressed the conference and repeated his earlier stance that reunification could not be imposed on any part of Cameroon. This could only be agreed by those who were ripe for it. In his opinion, it could therefore not be an option on the plebiscite. He stuck to his position of separation and independence. Endeley conceded that the majority of Southern Cameroonians supported separation without reunification, but ultimately, and for by then obvious reasons, he stuck to his position that the two plebiscite questions should be association with Nigeria versus reunification with Cameroon. The rest of the parties and leaders repeated earlier stands and opinions, albeit toning down their messages to appease the Council of Chiefs and natural rulers who were strongly in favour of independence. on behalf of the Council of Chiefs, the Fon of Barfoot, summed up their position as follows. French Cameroon is fire, and Nigeria is water. I support secession from Nigeria without reunification. At the end of the conference, the delegates voted 67% in favour of secession from Nigeria as the first question, and independence as the second plebiscite question, 33% in favour of integration with Nigeria and reunification with Cameroon as the second question. After combining these results and arriving at a compromise, the conference agreed that the people's wishes dictated that the plebiscite questions be integration with Nigeria and secession and independence. As soon as the monthly conference ended, Foncha, Endeley and others, accompanied by UK Commissioner J.O. Field, headed off to New York. Once more, Endeley and Foncha repeated earlier arguments in defence of their respective plebiscite question choices. It was generally accepted the first plebiscite question would be that of integration with Nigeria. The fierce debates revolved around the second question, whether it was going to be secession and independence, or reunification with French Cameroon. Foncha was pressured to defend his argument for secession instead of reunification. He was asked for details on how reunification would unfold with French Cameroon. With the goal of increasing his odds of winning, Endeley insisted on reunification as the second question. He was betting that voters would choose integration with Nigeria over reunification. Endeley argued that Foncha had no clear plan for southern Cameroons and was hiding his incompetence under the cloak of continued trusteeship administration. He challenged Foncha to another round of elections as a means of settling the future of southern Cameroons instead of a plebiscite whose results, he said, would be irreversible and could be regrettable. On his part, Billet argued that if southern Cameroons were to break away from Nigeria, it would cause the territory irreparable harm. He argued that Cameroon was an artificial creation and the idea of reunification was in itself questionable. When the hearings resumed, a week later, Billet reversed his position and stated that the UN should decide on what was just, not who was right, and asked for more time for southern Cameroons to decide its future. Billet's 180-degree turn was the result of a private negotiation organised by Andrew Cohen and representatives of the Afro-Asian states, aimed at agreeing on the second plebiscite question. Despite these off-record private negotiations, Andrew Cohen leveraged Sir Philipson's bleak financial report on southern Cameroons to persuade and recruit representatives of Afro-Asian states, including India's Krishna Menon, to support the UK's position that southern Cameroons was not economically viable and therefore should not be allowed to become independent. The Andrew Cohen-led agreement brokered between Foncha and Endeley on September 30th stipulated that southern Cameroons would separate from Nigeria in October 1960, when Nigeria would become independent. UK trusteeship would be extended to no later than October 1962, by which southern Cameroons should be independent. The issues of the plebiscite were to be integration with Nigeria versus reunification with French Cameroon. By proposing to extend the deadline for the plebiscite past the date of Nigeria's independence on October 1st, 1960, Andrew Cohen had masterfully delivered on Foncha's desire to separate from Nigeria without actually losing anything in return. The Fourth Committee of the UN was not pleased that Andrew Cohen had brokered a deal behind their backs and without their consent or involvement. Cohen, Menon, and others retorted that their approach had yielded results which had so far eluded the Fourth Committee. The Andrew Cohen compromise deal incited protests in southern Cameroons. The KNDP protested Foncha's decision to accept the second plebiscite question, and the party's leadership, under Augustin Dua, considered deposing Foncha as premier. Southern Cameroonians publicly opposed the decision based on the chosen plebiscite questions, because neither was the people's first choice. While some cheered separation from Nigeria, the Barfoot population group decried the extended trusteeship, calling it further colonialism. As the telegraphic petitions poured into the UN from southern Cameroons, the representatives of Ghana, Guinea, Liberia, Libya, Mexico, Sudan, Tunisia, the United States, the United Arab Republic, Cuba, Iran, and Panama got to work drafting a resolution based on the Andrew Cohen compromise deal. In his introductory remarks to the General Assembly on the draft resolution on October 16, 1959, the representative of Ireland, Mr. Kennedy, stated that in arranging for the people of southern Cameroons to make the difficult choice of joining its neighbours to the east or west, the United Nations was acting in the spirit and in compliance with the UN Charter. He couldn't have been more wrong. By adopting the Andrew Cohen Compromise into a resolution, the UN had essentially rubber-stamped the UK's wishes for southern Cameroons, in total disregard of the overwhelming majority of the freely expressed wishes of the people of the territory. In response to Mr. Kennedy, the representative of Iraq, Mr. Adnan Bachachi, questioned the urgency and wisdom of rushing a resolution on the plebiscite questions when the plebiscite itself had been postponed by more than a year. Mr. Bachachi further emphasised that it made no sense to proceed with a resolution on southern Cameroons when the plebiscite in northern Cameroons was yet to be conducted in November 1959. For these reasons, he indicated that Iraq would be abstaining from the vote on the pending resolution. After the debates, the General Assembly passed Resolution 1352 on the future of southern Cameroons, deciding that the plebiscite would take place between September 30th, 1960 and March 1961, recommending that the two questions to be asked in the plebiscite be: do you wish to achieve independence by joining the Independent Federation of Nigeria? Do you wish to achieve independence by joining the Independent Republic of Cameroon? Recommending that southern Cameroon separate from the Federation of Nigeria no later than October 1st, 1960. Imposing a plebiscite choice between an unpopular option and an even more unpopular option, the resolution biased the course of action available to the people of southern Cameroons. The resolution completely disregarded the conclusions of the August 1959 Mamfi Conference, overrode the freely expressed wishes of the people of southern Cameroons, and set the territory on a perilous path. Considering the power of the UK as the administrating authority in southern Cameroons all the way to the UN, southern Cameroon's hands were tied behind its back. To the chagrin of the UK government, the people of northern Cameroons voted in the November 1959 plebiscite not to join Nigeria. In response to, and no doubt at the behest of the UK, the UN passed Resolution 1471 in December 1959, deciding that the same two questions it had recommended for southern Cameroons be presented in a plebiscite to the people of northern Cameroons before March 1961, and the UK's fingerprints were all over Article 9. It completely discounted the effect of allowing northern Cameroonians participate in elections in Nigeria ahead of a plebiscite on their future. The UK would later use this opportunity to openly and aggressively lobby the people of northern Cameroons towards integration with Nigeria.
On January 1st, French Cameroon became the first of 17 African countries to celebrate its independence in 1960, the year that would later be called Africa's Year of Independence. In attendance at the ceremonies was the UN Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld. Following the ceremonies on January 2nd, he chaired a stormy meeting in Buea with Foncha and Ndele on the future of Southern Cameroons. He came away deciding that there should be a meeting between Foncha, Ndele, representatives of the Cameroon and Nigeria governments, and possibly the UK, to resolve the future of the Trust territory and avoid a plebiscite. Even Hammarskjöld had come to believe that a plebiscite, as it was defined, was not in the best interest of the people of Southern Cameroons. Following Dag Hammarskjöld's visit to Cameroons, his UN Security Director, Heinrich Weishoff, conveyed the Secretary-General's concerns to Christopher Eastwood, the Assistant Under-Secretary of State at the United Kingdom's Colonial Office in London. When Christopher Eastwood discussed Weishoff's concerns with the UK delegation at the United Nations, UK Representative Andrew Cohen stated that the Secretary-General's proposal was unacceptable. Andrew Cohen insisted that the UN had made a definite decision on conducting a plebiscite in the Cameroons, and the UK should not be party to circumventing the UN decision. 1960 saw the emergence of new political parties and alliances in the Southern Cameroons, with the majority of them advocating outright independence. Some of the new political faces included Paul Calais' Cameroon United Party, KUP, Cameroon's Commoners Congress, CCC, and Cameroon's Indigenes Party, CIP. In a January 26, 1960 petition to the UN, the KUP decried the choice of plebiscite questions, stating that they denied Southern Cameroons the right to self-determination. The KUP retorted that the third option of outright independence be put on a ballot. As the new year wore on and the plebiscite date drew closer, pressure started mounting for the KNDP to define the nature of reunification with French Cameroon. And more petitions were sent to UN threatening to boycott, sabotage, or otherwise discredit the upcoming plebiscite on account of the stark choices presented. In late January 1960, Christopher Eastwood chaired a meeting at the Colonial Office at Whitehall, where a decision was made to approach the President of Republic of Cameroon, Ahidjo, to begin discussions on the form of union between Southern Cameroons and French Cameroon. Eastwood suggested that Sir Sidney Philipson be invited to negotiate on behalf of Southern Cameroons, and the Colonial Office agreed that UN participation in any negotiations with Cameroon should be avoided if possible, and that J.O. Field, Commissioner of Southern Cameroons, should be told there was no point in the UN taking part. At that meeting, Emmanuel emphasised that it was the responsibility of Her Majesty's government to make sure that there were firm and clear terms of union with both Cameroon and Nigeria. As far back as May 1958, Nigeria had already defined the outline of what Southern and Northern Cameroons would get if they decided to achieve independence by joining Nigeria. By February 1960, it had become evident that the Republic of Cameroon was in no position to initiate discussion on reunification. As Foncha had rightly said, reunification could only be done by those who were ripe for it. An important reason for this lack of enthusiasm was that the Republic of Cameroon had become independent without having written a constitution or having held elections, and those were tasks it had to address shortly after independence. On February 10th, March 5th, March 17, 1960, the UK ambassador to Cameroon, Patrick Johnston, approached Ahidjo to open discussions on creating terms of reunification. On all occasions, Ahidjo and his vice president, Charles Asselet, told Johnston that nothing could be done until the end of May 1960, because the Republic of Cameroon was preparing for elections slated for April 10, 1960, following which would be inaugurations in May. On April 4, 1960, Ambassador Johnston shared his impression of the situation in the Cameroons with the Colonial Office. He stated that it was clear that what Foncha wanted was independence, and that he was going to campaign on the premise that a vote for Cameroon in the upcoming plebiscite would mean a vote against joining Nigeria. Furthermore, if talks for reunification with Cameroon failed, a vote for Cameroon would simply mean independence for Southern Cameroons. Johnston's letter was forwarded on to Andrew Cohen at the UN at the request of Eastwood. In a subsequent April 1960 memo from Johnston to the Colonial Office, he asked for clarification again from the Colonial Office that if the negotiations between Ahidjo and Foncha ended up being dialogue of the deaf, wouldn't the plebiscite questions have to be changed to union with Nigeria or independence? Johnston advised the Colonial Office that his earliest estimate of a time frame for earnest talks on reunification were June 1960. On behalf of the Colonial Office, Robert Boothby wrote back to Johnston resolutely rejecting the idea of an independent Southern Cameroons on the basis that the territory was poor. He went on to say that an independent Southern Cameroons could become a financial embarrassment to the UK, and signed off by stating that the sooner we can wash our hands off Southern Cameroons, the more pleased we shall be. And so it was that after failing to nudge Southern Cameroons into a union with Nigeria prior to 1959, having fabricated the myth that the territory was poor, the Colonial Office was directing its ambassador to Cameroon to cease and desist all objective analyses in the matter of Southern Cameroons. In May 1960, the UN Trusteeship Council passed a resolution requiring the UK to define with clarity the constitutional agreements and guarantees that would come with each of the plebiscite choices of joining Nigeria or Cameroon. On June 4 and June 9, 1960, the ambassador again reached out to Ahidjo and was finally told that Ahidjo would welcome a visit to Southern Cameroons in July 1960 to initiate discussions on the terms for reunification. In June 1960, Andrew Cohen wrote 2 confidential memos to the Colonial Office in London, stating that the UK must use its influence at the UN and in negotiations between Southern Cameroons and the Republic of Cameroon to rule out what was now being referred to as the third question, the independence of Southern Cameroons. He went as far as to say that the UK could make a public statement on behalf of the UN, but without its consent, stating that the UN would not welcome renegotiations of the plebiscite questions, as was being discussed in the Southern Cameroons House of Assembly, to dissuade Foncha, who was planning to return to the UN. From July 15th to the 17th, 1960, Ahidjo made his first official state visit to Southern Cameroons. As much as they tried, Ambassador Johnston and Southern Cameroons Commissioner J.O. Field failed to keep the visit from turning political. To their embarrassment and that of Ndele and the government of Nigeria, Foncha invited Ahidjo to attend a political rally in Victoria, putting them in the very uncomfortable position of promoting Foncha's agenda at their expense. At the conclusion of Ahidjo's maiden visit, the governments of Southern Cameroons and the Republic of Cameroon agreed to reunite on a federal basis. Ahidjo gave his assurance that if the plebiscite went in favour of joining the Republic of Cameroon, he would simply need a 2 out of 3 majority of the National Assembly to amend its constitution to incorporate Southern Cameroons, a task he was sure he could easily accomplish. 2 days after the visit, on July 20, the Southern Cameroons minister held a meeting with John Field, the commissioner. They informed him that based on their closed-door discussions, Ahidjo had made it clear that if the plebiscite went in favour of joining the Republic of Cameroon, he expected both territories to remain independent and slowly grow together, similar to the kind of relationship that Ghana and Guinea once had. They said Ahidjo had gone as far as promising to take this up with the UN on the grounds that how and when the people of Cameroons reunify was their business. The reason Ahidjo was reluctant to proceed with the immediate reunification was because the Republic of Cameroon was heavily dependent on aid from France and could not afford to make any new financial commitments, something the UK was expecting the Republic to do with respect to Southern Cameroons upon reunification. In reporting this development to Ian MacLeod, the Secretary of the Colonies in London, James Patterson, the Governor of Nigeria, expressed their grave concern that the prospect of a long and independent state prior to reunification would swell the vote against Nigeria. The Governor suggested that the UK consider enticing the Foncha government with proposals for a road here, the repair of a bridge there, minor schemes for community development, with the hopes of turning the tide against the likelihood of independence back to their preferred option of integration with Nigeria. On August 2, 1960, the Colonial Office discussed Governor Patterson's letter and considered several alternatives for making clear to Ahidjo and Foncha that a period of independence for Southern Cameroons was out of the question. They decided that raising a local military in Southern Cameroons after the British left would hurt their relationship with Nigeria, who would consider such a move as support for the independence of Southern Cameroons. After ruling out using their influence at the UN, William Ryrie suggested that the UK government approach France to influence Ahidjo to take over the responsibility of Southern Cameroons immediately, should the plebiscite go in favour of the Republic of Cameroon, and to also dissuade Ahidjo from approaching the UN on the matter. In early August, 3 Southern Cameroon ministers had a second round of talks with the government of the Republic of Cameroon in Yaoundé. At the end of August 1960, Commissioner John Field wrote a memo to the Colonial Office presenting a most accurate assessment of the situation in Southern Cameroons. He said the Southern Cameroons ministers were feeling pressured by the UK to strike a reunification deal with the Republic of Cameroon, yet Ahidjo only seemed interested in a nominal association and did not have the finances to provide internal security for Southern Cameroons if the plebiscite went in favour of joining the Republic. The ministers told the commissioner that Ahidjo had also told them that reunification would not take place until Southern Cameroons had built up its full complement of government services. In his memo, Commissioner Field admitted that the people of Southern Cameroons were against integration with Nigeria, and almost certainly not in favour of subjecting themselves to French law, language, or police force. He said the UN Secretary General's pledge of support to new nations had given Southern Cameroons hope that if Ahidjo did not want to reunite immediately, as the British were insisting, that Southern Cameroons would look to the UN for assistance if the need arose. Commissioner Field warned the Colonial Office that forcing Foncha to acknowledge the reunification would be immediate would not improve the chance for integration with Nigeria. Rather, he suspected the people would instead rally behind the KUP and CCC parties that spoke more nearly for the true wishes of the people than any other party. Commissioner Field concluded his memo by stating that with every passing day, the 2 plebiscite questions were losing relevance with respect to the situation in Southern Cameroons. He advised the Colonial Office to accept the distinct possibility that it would not be able to implement either of the plebiscite alternatives, in which case the UK should begin preparing for the third option, that of independence for Southern Cameroons. On October 1st, Nigeria became independent. On the same day, Southern Cameroons separated from Nigeria, and the Southern Cameroons Order in Council of Constitution came into effect. After attending the Nigeria independence celebration, the Under-Secretary of the Colonies, Christopher Eastwood, visited Southern Cameroons. Judging by how slow reunification negotiations were proceeding between Foncha and Ahidjo, Eastwood confessed that he expected the Southern Cameroons government to ask the UK for help in securing its complete independence. Owing to what he observed as difficulties in defining the nature of the reunion between Southern Cameroons and the Republic of Cameroon, especially ahead of the plebiscite campaigns, He openly questioned the validity of pursuing a plebiscite as the means of determining the political future of Southern Cameroons. On the 7th of October, Eastwood sent a top-secret telegram to the UK's representative at the UN, Sir Andrew Cohen, asking for further instructions on a plan to overthrow the Foncha KNDP party. The plan had been to summon Miss Josepha Muir to the Commissioner's office to apply pressure on her to re-sign her KNDP seat in the House of Assembly. The idea was to force the KNDP to lose its majority over Ndele's Cameroon's People's National Convention, CPNC, the party created from the KNC-KPP merger. However, this plan was abandoned when Eastwood advised that regardless of whether or not Foncha was premier, Southern Cameroons would most likely not vote to integrate with Nigeria. On October 12th, Andrew Cohen rejected Eastwood's suggestion that Ndele and Foncha might attend the next UN session to request a review of the plebiscite questions. Considering that Foncha and Ndele had requested a meeting with the UK's Secretary of State for the Colonies, Ian MacLeod, Andrew Cohen recommended that the London meeting be delayed as much as possible, so as to leave too little time for Foncha and Ndele to be able to travel to New York to attend the upcoming UN session. Cohen concluded that the longer the plebiscite program was implemented, the more difficult it would be for the Southern Cameroons government to try to reverse or stop it. The Earl of Perth, Sir David Drummond, the then Minister of State at the Colonial Office, equally responded to Eastwood's telegram of October 12, 1960, advising that every effort must be made to dissuade and stop Southern Cameroons from contemplating the option of going back to the UN to request for independence. He signed off his remarks to Eastwood by stating that Southern Cameroons and its inhabitants are undoubtedly expendable. As October 1960 wore on, Commissioner John Field noted in a memo to the Colonial Office that pressure was continuing to mount within the government and opposition parties in Southern Cameroons to exit the plebiscite and ask for independence. He noted that Ndele's CPNC party was split, with the former KPP leaders regretting the choice of the second plebiscite question. They had come to realise that Southern Cameroons would not vote to integrate with Nigeria, but they remained opposed to joining the Republic of Cameroon. The Commissioner concluded his memo by stating, "It is very much in the cards that the Southern Cameroons representatives will arrive in London with a united demand that the plebiscite be called off, that the country should be granted independence by itself, and that the leaders will not be slow to carry their demands to the UN." Between October 10th to the 14th, 1960, Foncha, Jua, Muna, and Effiom met with the government of the Republic of Cameroon for the third time to discuss terms of reunification. Their meeting concluded with an outline for a draft constitution for a democratic federal united Cameroon Republic. The agreement was signed by Charles Asselet on behalf of the Republic of Cameroon and by Foncha on behalf of Southern Cameroons, and published as a communiqué and joint declaration on October 14th, 1960. One sentence in the communiqué summed up the spirit of the agreement, much to the chagrin of the UK government. The application of this reunification on the federal basis could not be automatic but gradual. After the joint communiqué was published, Ambassador Johnston went on an information fishing expedition at the presidency. In his discussion with Ahidra, Ambassador Johnston hinted that the UK's expectation was that the trusteeship would be terminated and sovereignty transferred as soon as possible if the plebiscite went in favour for the Republic of Cameroon. However, Johnston expressed concern that while the joint declaration and communiqué had dealt with constitutional matters, they had not addressed the financial responsibilities for Southern Cameroons if the vote went in favour of joining Cameroon, in terms of building up with its full government capacity and providing for internal security. In response, Ahidra said economic questions about Southern Cameroons were Foncha's responsibilities. He expected that Foncha would have better answers after his London meeting with Ian MacLeod, the Secretary of State for the Colonies. When Johnston pressed Ahidra for when official discussion with the UK government could start, Ahidra responded, not before Foncha returned from London with some economic guarantees. Johnston informed the Colonial Office that Foncha was using the difficulty of economic questions as leverage to continue pursuing the independence of southern Cameroons. On internal security, Ahidjo was in favour of Foncha raising a military force prior to reunification at Foncha's expense, and not at the expense of the Republic of Cameroon. Although southern Cameroons had officially separated from Nigeria on October 1st, 1960, the responsibilities of the defunct government of Nigeria had simply been transferred to the UK High Commissioner, and directives for southern Cameroons continued to flow through Lagos, Nigeria. In the third week in October, Basil Greenhill of the Commonwealth Relations Office, CRO, in London sent a memo to David Hunt, the UK High Commissioner, in Lagos, sharing comment from Andrew Cohen. In light of the change in tone in southern Cameroons against the plebiscite and the desire for outright independence, the memo conceded that it was possible that the UN could reopen the southern Cameroons case if Endeley and Foncha made it to the UN. The Colonial Office advised Lagos to delay Foncha and Endeley's London visit as long as possible, because any change in plans could open up the possibility of northern Cameroons nurturing dreams of independence, a development that would upset Nigeria and hurt its relationship with the UK. After meeting with the Southern Cameroons ministers on October 18, 1960, Deputy Commissioner Milne summarised the situation as follows to the Colonial Office. Southern Cameroon's minister were optimistic about the chances of the territory going independent because Ahidjo had stated that he was not interested in immediate reunification if the plebiscite went in favour of the Republic of Cameroon. At the time, the Cameroon government was itself being heavily financed by the government of France and was not in any position to take over new financial responsibilities from the British government. This non-stop demands on the Ahidjo government by Foncha at the insistence of the UK government would yet again earn Southern Cameroon's unenviable public opinion in French Cameroon of being broke and begging Ahidjo for financial assistance. Nothing could have been further from the truth. As an alternative, the Southern Cameroons minister, having never forgotten the words of UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, now planned to request for financial and technical assistance from the UN and the UK governments in order to expand government services and raise a security force. As the tide continued to turn against the UK's position, Malcolm Milne noted that the second plebiscite question is no longer the bogey question that Endeley and the UK government had hoped it would be. On October 26, 1960, in an attempt to weaken Foncha's bargaining power, the Southern Cameroons Commissioner J.O. Field informed Jalal Abdo, the plebiscite commissioner, that Foncha had signed the communique and draft federal constitution on October 14, 1960, not on behalf of the Southern Cameroons government, but rather on a personal basis or as leader of the KNDP. J.O. Field essentially dismissed the Ahidjo-Foncha agreement because reunification, being gradual and not immediate, would leave open the door for the independence of Southern Cameroons. On October 29th, Andrew Cohen wrote a memo to Ian MacLeod, the Secretary of the Colonies in London, correcting Malcolm Milne's view of the political landscape in Southern Cameroons, but more importantly, setting the stage for how the UK would ultimately rid itself of Southern Cameroons if the plebiscite did not go in favour of joining Nigeria. Despite the setback, they were suffering with Ahidjo not being in favour of immediate reunification. Cohen once more strongly advised that Foncha be categorically told that independence was off the table. Furthermore, he insisted that Foncha be told that sovereignty for Southern Cameroons would be transferred not to him, but rather to the Federal United Republic, failure for which Cohen believed Foncha would seek UN membership. Cohen advised that once the trusteeship was terminated and sovereignty was transferred, there would be no recourse for Southern Cameroons to appeal the UN because they would now belong to a sovereign state, making it an internal matter. Cohen went on to advise Eastwood that the UK should be very cautious in making agreements for the internal security of Southern Cameroons in preparation for the termination of trusteeship. He said they needed to have assurance that a Shombi-type situation would not develop in Southern Cameroons, whereas Southern Cameroon's military could be used as leverage to declare independence. Cohen was referring to Moise Shombi of Katanga province in Congo. Owing to a crisis in the Congo in June 1960 and using his internal security force, Shombi had declared Katanga an independent country. Cohen summarized by saying they could not take any action on creating a local military for Southern Cameroons, or committing financially to expand the government before the plebiscite for fear of hurting their relationship with Nigeria. Cohen concluded his letter by agonizing about whether or not to present the draft joint communique between Ahidjo and Foncha, the UN Secretary General. On the one hand, sharing the letter could give Foncha leverage because it showed that French Cameroon was not moving as fast as the UN wanted it to. Not sharing it could prove embarrassing if the Cameroon delegation at the UN informed the Secretary General. Acknowledging that the current Ahidjo-Foncha agreement was not in their best interest, Cohen advised that they stall until the London meeting in November. As planned, a delegation representing the people and government of Southern Cameroons travelled to London for a conference with the Secretary of the Colonies, Ian MacLeod, from November 10 to 13, 1960. Given that the terms of joining Nigeria had long been defined, the purpose of the London conference was to confirm that meaning of independence by joining Cameroon, and to correctly interpret the meaning of Ahidjo's gradual reunification. The delegation included members from all political parties represented in the Southern Cameroons Assembly, as well as natural chiefs of Bali and Mamfe. At the conference, the Southern Cameroons delegation presented the argument that the plebiscite questions were too rigid, and that they would like a request to be made to the UN with a view to cancelling the plebiscite in favour of outright independence. When consulted, Andrew Cohen at the UN countered that the Afro-Asian and Latin America states, as well as all other UK allies, would strongly oppose overturning the plebiscite resolution of October 1959. That response threw the conference into confusion, misunderstandings erupted, suspicions developed, and exchanges became acrimonious. With hopes dashed, the conference resigned itself to interpreting the meaning of the second plebiscite question. At the conclusion of the conference, the Secretary of the Colonies stated that if the plebiscite went in favour of Cameroon, there would be no extension of the trusteeship, nor separate independence for Southern Cameroons. Furthermore, Ian MacLeod declared that an early date for the creation of the Federal United Republic of Cameroon would be decided by the governments of the UK, Southern Cameroons, and the Republic of Cameroon, and that a constitutional conference would be convened after the plebiscite, to be attended by all four governments and representatives of the UN, at which the details of the constitution of the new Federal Republic would be ironed out. While Endeley and members of the opposition agreed with the Secretary of State, Foncha still expressed the hope that the United Nations would be consulted to give an authoritative ruling. However, they all agreed that in the meantime, so long as Ahidjo agreed with the Secretary of State's interpretation, and the United Nations did not resolve in favour of independence for Southern Cameroons, Ian MacLeod's interpretation would be acceptable to all. In anticipation of Foncha coming back to the UN, on November 18, 1960, Andrew Cohen fired off a memo to the Colonial Office discussing defensive tactics he planned to use with the help of the Nigerian delegation at the UN. Andrew Cohen advised that whatever tactics the UK adopted during debates and elections at the UN, the clear objective should be to block Foncha from pursuing independence, codenamed the Third Question. And as he had done many times before, Andrew Cohen warned that not blocking the Third Question could cost the UK its good relations with Nigeria, by losing not only Southern Cameroons, but potentially also Northern Cameroons. Considering the overwhelming pressure from the Colonial Office and Andrew Cohen at the UN, Foncha was directed once more to consult with Ahidjo, and only if an arrangement could not be arrived at, should the UN option be entertained. Consequently, upon returning from London, Foncha and his ministers met with the Republic of Cameroon in Yaoundé on December 1st. They agreed to the interpretation by the Secretary of State, Ian MacLeod. Having secured this agreement with Ahidjo, Foncha felt confident and chose to no longer pursue the issue of the United Nations. With less than 2 months to go before the plebiscite commissioner, Jalal Abdo, was under increasing pressure to print and distribute plebiscite campaign information on the meaning of independence by joining Cameroon. On December 12, 1960, Commissioner Abdo told J.O. Field, the Commissioner of Southern Cameroons, that Andrew Cohen had advised the UN Fourth Committee that the meaning of the joining Cameroon had been settled and need not be debated anymore. Consequently, Abdo asked that, given the new Foncha-Ahidjo agreement on December 2nd, was the possibility of outright independence after the plebiscite now clearly off the table? To which J.O. Field replied on December 16, 1960, advising that final clarification on the official statement from the Republic of Cameroon would only be available after Ahidjo returned to the country, and that the UK would not be discussing the matter at the December 1960 UN session. Ahidjo had travelled to Congo-Brazzaville to attend a conference for French Africa heads of state from December 15 to 20, 1960. At the conference, Ahidjo would discuss the matter of the immediate unification of southern Cameroons with Jacques Foccart, France's Minister of African Affairs, the man credited for creating France-Afrique. Upon his return on December 20, 1960, Ahidjo and his ministers once more met with Foncha and his ministers in Douala. Ahidjo had had a change of heart. He now accepted that if the plebiscite went in favour of Cameroon, unification would be immediate and not gradual, ruling out a period of independence for southern Cameroons as the UK government had so shamelessly fought for. Following that meeting, the Cameroon Ministry of Foreign Affairs published a note verbale on December 24, 1960, agreeing fully to the wishes of the UK government. And thus came to a close, a year full of back-channel manoeuvring by the United Kingdom over the fate of southern Cameroons. On the surface and from all appearances in 1960, the UK acted impartially as the administrating authority of southern Cameroons. However, as declassified documents now show, the UK's actions in 1960 were understandably, though irresponsibly, only in its economic and political interests. It is for these interests that it blocked the independence of southern Cameroons and fought so hard to integrate it with Nigeria, all while claiming that the territory was poor. While these now declassified documents, as well as the real intentions of the British in the period leading up to 1961, were once hidden, there were many clues hidden in plain sight illustrating that the UK's integration of southern Cameroons with Nigeria was a foregone conclusion. One such clue was the construction of the Bamenda General Hospital, which is now called the Regional Hospital Bamenda. Commissioned in 1956, the hospital was constructed using funds generated from southern Cameroons, instead of being commissioned by Dr. Emmanuel Ndele, who at the time was the head of the Southern Cameroons government and incidentally also a medical doctor, or by the then UK Commissioner of Southern Cameroons. All credit was given to the Governor and the Federation of Nigeria. By divesting British colonies and trust territories as fast as he could in 1960, Ian MacLeod was living up to his wish to be the last Secretary of the colonies. Regrettably, in the case of southern Cameroons, he was doing so in violation of the UK's trusteeship agreement, and with no regard to the freely expressed wishes of the people.
This is a production of the Ambazonia Communication Network in collaboration with Menda Films. We invite you to look forward to our next episode as we continue to explore the historical path of the former British Trust territory of southern Cameroon, now called Ambazonia. Special thanks to our donors and to all viewers like you. For more information on this program, please contact our partners Menda Films on www.mendafilms.com or visit us at www.acnlive.net.
Hail this land of glory, we the Ambazonia, special loyalty, presence to our Savior who granted us the freedom, allegiance to the hero, for God alone we gather, glory to glory, we rise and never to fall. Here in a nation, flowing with the glory, 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 glory to the Father for making you a nation, a joy forevermore. Ambazonia, land of freedom, you shall live in plenty, meeting our need, and your children shall be like the stars above. The Most High God be the watchman of this nation. Ambazonia, land of freedom, you shall live in plenty, meeting our need, and your children shall be like the stars above. The Most High God be the watchman of this nation.
Good evening, fellow Ambazonians. Greetings, patriots, nationalists, and our courageous people. The stakes are extremely high. During such moments, leadership is critical for the success of our liberation and for the outcome that we seek and we are sacrificing for. Dr. Cho Lucas Ayaba, the leader of our liberation struggle, is on the line to address our people on the eve of our Independence Day celebration. The occupiers' intent must be taken into consideration. The occupier is scheming, creating all sorts of narratives to distort, to distract, to divert. They have injected a new narrative within the opposition with a hope to lower the international system into a new bait. That is why leadership is essential for us to maintain a singular point of focus. That is why at this moment, leadership provides clarity, a sense of direction, and assurance. The leader wants to address our people tonight as the creator of the liberation strategy, the embodiment of the liberation vision. He knows where we are, what is going on, Pay attention. Your victory is here. Listen to the leader very carefully. Listen emotionally. Listen spiritually.